I'm going to talk about our gods, ourselves, myth, morality, and spectacle in the Ring's Divine Comedy. It's a little bit off, as you've probably heard, the mainstream of what I do. But given I actually study most of my scholarly life is focused on the revival of classical ideas in the Renaissance, particularly around the metaphysics and cosmology there. So I guess it's not too far apart. But basically, I was given my topic by Hugh and Jenna, who said, please come and give us a talk, and please talk about this. So, you know, I'm always very obedient, as my colleagues at SIT know. And actually, to be honest with you, it's sometimes fun to be given something and then have to kind of work with it. So this is what you're hearing today, and I've really enjoyed putting this together and doing something a little different, especially as it touches on something else that interests me. So, I do believe I have a ring in my hand. It is a strange thing that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing. Such a little thing. Does anybody know where that's from? Everybody's thinking, which Lord of the Rings, thank you. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I went to Lord of the Rings first, because that's obviously what one does. And I know that you've come to hear a lecture about the ring cycle, but I start today with a quotation from another epic about a ring, the Lord of the Rings. Yes, Boromir on the hillside looking up at the ring. This isn't a coincidence. One epic story about a ring using Norse, Anglo-Saxon and Celtic mythology and stories compared with another epic story. And yes, Tolkien was inspired by Wagner's cycle. So we can say that, you know, I can put as many Lord of the Rings references in as I want. Both center on a ring, this least of rings. That is everything. That inspires greed and desire in those who see it or touch it. That will dehumanize and destroy those who take it. And that holds within it a power of hate and darkness that can and will, in the case of Wagner, consume the world. This is the whole thing, everything. A circle that contains all, that consumes everything and everybody within it. And it has no beginning and no end. It is the Midgard, or the world serpent, that encircles our human world, the head eating its tail. It contains the world bound by the laws, as figured in the Spear of Wotan and the weavings of the fates. Within it is the drama of the human soul, the commedia humana, the grand panoply of human life. But this ring, this encompassing of all, also contains the drama of the immortals that wish to rule them. It is the commedia humana, or life is here, caught within a drama where the ending is already determined at the beginning. But it is also a commedia divina, a divine comedy, where the gods and other immortals, through their own fickleness, deceit, and desire for power, have made for us a trap, where these characters, Wotan, Fricka, Freya, Alberich, Brunhilde, and so many others, are caught by their actions forever. A comedy in that the fabric of human and divine life is here, but also a comedy in that these figures are fools, posers, thieves and liars who cannot see themselves as they truly are, and who are willing to break the laws that bind together the world in order to rule a world that is already theirs. I could drop this ring now, but you probably wouldn't get a good view, and anyway, and I'd lose it as well, so I'm not going to do that. But if I do, and as I seem to remember my Lord of the Rings films well, which I do, it will fall with a great, single, satisfying thud. You've no doubt seen the films too. They even created, you know, a special noise, something that brought across to the watching audience in the movie theaters and at home the importance of this ring. what the ring contained, the literal weightiness of this thing that can bring down a world and a world order. Unfortunately, I don't have that sound effect, and we're on a stage, not in a movie, and this is like theatre. We are here to see our divine comedy played out in front of us, not on the screen or in a book, but with sound and music filling this theatre of the Latchis. In this space, we are in the world of Valhalla, here, the realm of the Nibelungs and Midgard, our Earth. Out here, out with you, we're in that special place of the audience at a live event, that dark space where anything can happen. And while we watch, as if through a window into some mythic space where the world of the ring plays out eternally, we are surrounded too by other watchers. The comedy of Wotan, his greed and the destruction that it brings to everybody around him is watched, and we are watched. Silently, impassively, by these gods and immortals. The classical proscenium, with its Athena and its muses, frames our story, just like the ring. The icy perfection of a reconstituted classical world, as denoted here in the Latchis, frames our experience to act as a judge and a jury for both we, the spectators, and the human, all too human, beings of the ring. We are being judged by them, and they are also judging what is happening on stage. So this morning, we're going to look through the ring at the gods on our stage. Who are they? What are their stories? What are their motives? Why are they leading themselves again and again into this cycle, this repetitive, eternal drama of self-destruction? Then we will look at these gods, the older gods, looking on with blank eyes and a fair degree of cold amusement at their young relatives. Are they any different? How many mistakes did they make? We will turn them beyond the myth to morality. How shall we judge these flawed divinities? And why must our gods be so human? Finally, we will turn to the spectacle, the multiple layers that bring all of us together. The fallible gods of our play, the ones who stand in silent judgment in our theatre, who frame our spectacle, and the ultimate judge, you, our audience. What do you see through the classical arch, through this half of the circle, as you look into the divine comedy of the ring? What are we all watching and judging? An epic, a tragedy, or indeed simply a commedia, a comedy? And what does that mean for us, for you, in the dark, the spectators of these worlds of our own making? So let's start with, first of all, the gods of the ring. And I'll introduce a few of them, for those of you who are not up on your Norse mythology right now. First of all, the origins of the ring cycle are, mainly in two different areas. First of all, and I have to tell you, I have no German, so I apologize for any German pronunciations during this. The Nibelungenlied, I think I got that about right. Hugh's giving me applause, that's right. But, so the origins of the ring are in the Nibelungenlied, and also in another story that I will come to in just a second, called the Otter's Ransom, or Andvari the Dwarf's Ring. But the Nibelungenlied is actually a story of Siegfried and Brunhilde and Hagen and Alberich, but has no gods. The immortals are not present. It is called by some the German Iliad, and in that sense we think of it as an epic, but it really is truly a human comedy. And there is nothing of the concept of the Iliad of Greece, which I will come to a little later. So it's an epic, but without the framing of classical epic. The Otter's Ransom belongs to a slightly different genre, and it's more connected to Norse traveling sagas, which are those collection of folkloric tales which really are about the different gods of Norse mythology. So when you probably got that book when you were younger, you know, Great Norse Legends, those were the ones you were reading, you know, all these little collected folk tales. And they really were sort of travelers' tales about the divine. And the one that is important to us, as I said, is the Otter's Ransom. And I can give you a little brief overview of what that says. So Odin and Heimdall and Loki decide to go down to Midgard. And they go down through this massive snowstorm. And I was actually saying to Hugh and Jenna the other day that this so reminded me of the beginning of the Valkyries. So if you haven't seen it yet, expect a massive snowstorm at the beginning. And we're hurtling down from the heavens, from Valhalla, to Midgard at the beginning of the Valkyries. And it's just like in the Otter's Ransom, where they go through this massive storm to reach Midgard. And they get into Midgard, and the weather clears, and they're by a river, and they see an otter with a big fat salmon. And Loki, being Loki, who is the god of like thieving and treachery and deceit, etc., and fire, and he's a little bit like a kind of a Hermes or Mercury figure when it comes to Greek mythology. He takes a stone and he throws it at the otter, and he manages to kill it with one shot. And he's very pleased with himself, and he says, look, we've caught both an otter and a salmon at the same time, so we've got two things to eat tonight. So they take the otter and the salmon, and they go off and they find a farmer's farmstead. And they go in and they ask if they can be the guests of the farmstead, thus creating a relationship between them and the person who lives there, because the farmer, he's a little begrudging, but he says, okay, I'll put you up for the night. And so they've established, shall we say, guest right. They've established that there is, they are guests in this person's house, which is important. I'll come back to that later. So they say, and hey, we've brought food with us. And they give the otter and the salmon, at which point the farmer goes, turns out it's his son, because we are in the world of Norse mythology, and his son is a shapeshifter and becomes an otter at night, so that during the day, so that he can go fishing for the whole family. So basically, Loki has just killed his host's son. And so obviously, then there is a debt to be paid. And so they make an agreement that the debt is that they will skin the otter and lay out the skin. And the skin must be covered in gold, every single part of it, to ransom his son's life. So Odin says to Loki, okay, you go off and deal with this. So Loki goes off. Long story, I'll make it short, he goes down to the world of the Dark Elves and finds a pool. And he throws a net in that he's borrowed from the sea god's wife, and captures a pike, which when he holds it in the net, turns into the dwarf Andvari. And he steals from the dwarf and the pool all of the dwarf's treasure, except for he notices the dwarf is holding back a ring. And so, after much discussion, he manages to take the ring from the dwarf as well, and of course the dwarf curses him and says that whoever has this treasure, there's going to be no good from it. Loki goes back to Odin, spreads all the gold on the otter's pelt, and they think they're about to walk away, and their host says, well, hang on a second, there's the edge of a whisker on the otter that's not covered. And at that point, Loki has to give up the ring. So I think you probably all know the ring cycle sufficiently to see the connections between these two pieces. So this means that the inception of the ring cycle is very much connected to both this idea of a human epic, the Nibelungenlied, but also to these folk stories, this mythos around the Norse gods. Obviously, a lot has been changed in our story, and the person in the story who commits the, shall we say, original sin is Loki, whereas here it is Odin. And there's a lot of other kind of playing around that we can come back to. So who is this Odin figure? And what is kept into the ring cycle? Well, Wotan, or Odin, we know him as the all-wise. He's the father of knowledge, he's the father of battles, he's the father of everything. He is also the holder of the spear of the laws, all the treaties that have been made that bind everybody together. He rules the worlds, but he is also ruled by the inevitability of the actions that he has put into play. He has essentially broken his own rules and his own treaties in order to get himself into this situation. And unfortunately, he can't find a way out of it. Fricka, his wife, also represents bonds that tie us. And in that respect, that's why they're the father and the mother of the gods. They both, in many respects, represent that natural order and the customs, social conventions that tie us together into an ethical framework. So Fricka is the goddess of marriage, right or wrong, the bonds that tie us, the laws that ensure our harmony. And this is not a small thing, because it's through marriage that you have the inheritance of property and of rank. So there cannot be a natural order, as one might think of it, in terms of being able to hand on in a stable manner your rank, your inheritance, your genes, etc., without the bonds of marriage. However, they have come about. And of course, we're plunged into this horrible ethical dilemma when we watch the ring cycle, because we look at the rules of marriage, but at the same time, we have a situation where somebody has been forced into a marriage. So in that situation, should those rules apply? Freya is the love that Wotan is willing to give up, but she is also immortality, and I've already mentioned Loki. The other character that I think is worth mentioning briefly is Erda. Erda, the mother of the Valkyries, who will gather heroes for Wotan's slave army. And by the way, Hugh, I loved your description of the slave army, of the heroes. I've never thought of the heroes of Valhalla as an army of kind of zombie slaves. There's another film in that, I think, somewhere. He is hiding his need for a bunch of heroes against the Nibelung under the guise of a warrior heaven. But Erda is also the mother of the fates, and she is the one who tells Wotan about how things will end and what he needs to do. This is our kind of cast of characters on the Norse side. Well, what about the Greeks, those people who are watching us all? The muses are on either side of us, I think. I keep looking at them. I think they're the muses, so let's go with that. Athena is up here. She's pretty obvious. And then we've got some great murals. So over there we have Psyche, who is the representation of soul. And she's taking a look at her lover, who is Cupid, the god of love. And if you know that story, they've entered into a relationship, but the idea is that she must never see who is her lover. And one night she can't resist, and she takes a light, and she goes in there and sees him sleeping. And he's about to wake up and see her there, and then he has to leave her forever. So it's a story around love and the breaking of love. And above, I think it's Apollo, but it could also be the tragic chariot ride of Phaeton, the son of Apollo, who thinks that he can control the horses of the sun, but is actually leading them towards destruction. And up here, we have, I suspect, it is the twins, Apollo and Artemis, but above them, you can see there's a very kind of like happy, wise looking couple, sitting enthroned on some fluffy clouds. That looks to me like Zeus and Hera, and of course those are vital to what we're talking about here today and the comparisons with the ring cycle. So this is the panoply that we have around us. But then I shouldn't miss out what is above us. We have the astrological chart. And that is the celestial world, to borrow from my real scholarly field for once. This is the celestial world, which is bound by the fates, because it's the movement of the planets. And so the gods, the immortal gods of the Greeks, are covered and overwhelmed by the rule of the celestial heavens. That as the signs go round, as the portents changed, this will impact all of them, and maybe also all of us. So it's a very portentous scene that we find ourselves in. So Zeus is obviously the person who is similar to Wotan, and just like Wotan and Odin, key to what he is and who he is the importance of custom and of trust. Indeed, he marries 4 times, and then of course you probably are aware he had numerous other relationships. He was always dropping in on somebody. But the first 3 of those marriages are actually allegories, and they're kind of important. And then the 4th is Hera, who is the goddess of marriage. The mother-law and the father-law, shall we say. The first 2 of these allegories are very much related to the conversation around Wotan in the ring cycle. And they're key components of what it is to be the father of the gods. So first of all, Zeus marries Metis, who is cleverness, which connects to Wotan's being the father of all knowledge. And then he marries Themis, who is law or justice. She, by the way, you're probably thinking, who is Themis? Haven't come across her. Actually, you have. She's probably one of the most famous and ubiquitous examples of Greek mythology that you'll see in every day. She's the woman who's got the blindfold on with the scales and the sword. She's justice. But she's not human justice, she is divine justice. Actually, the story goes that it depends which hand her sword is in. If her left hand is holding the sword and her right hand is holding the scales, then she's divine justice. If it's swapped over, it's the rule of human law, which is considered almost a degraded form of justice. So it's kind of interesting to see how people thought of this in their particular societies. But Themis is vital. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, because it really is central to the ring cycle. Themis is connected, and to move sideways again, to an even older mythological cycle, into Egyptian mythology, where her sister is something called Ma'at. And Ma'at is the, you could call her a goddess, but actually she's divine balance. So when you see those pictures on pyramids and things of the soul being judged at the end, and there is scales, and on one is the heart of the person, and on the other is a feather, that feather is Ma'at. It is divine balance. And in the Old Kingdom, for instance, in Egypt, the pharaoh, the reason why the pharaoh was so important was not because they were a god per se, but because they represented in their own bodies and in their own actions the very divine order of balance and harmony. They needed to express and be Ma'at for the whole of the people. Now, I tell you this to give you a sense of what Themis really is. She's just not some goddess like this. She is the power that binds together the universe, and without her, we cannot have our divine or human comedy. And she is also very much there, even though you don't see her in the ring cycle. This is exactly what Wotan is dealing with. Zeus is therefore all-knowing, and he is the overseer of natural order. He's the person enacting natural order, but he is not natural order. He combines force of intelligence, and his reign is governed by law. He's governed by his wife. This should have been Wotan's reign too, not one of force and whim. And don't get me wrong here, I'm not suggesting that Zeus is not a god of whim as well and force, but there are some significant differences which I'll come to. In terms of their children, Zeus produces Athena from Metis. She is the warrior virgin goddess, and of course the obvious connection is with Brunhilde and the Valkyries. The seasons and the fates come from the union with Venus. So the father of all, the protector of the laws, marries divine order, natural order and justice, the thing that keeps the cosmos together, and they produce from this the fates, which we see here outlined in the astrological symbols. So Zeus produces the fates, he is the father of the fates, but he is also ruled by them. He is caught in a trap of his own making, literally as their father. He cannot act differently to the way things are fated to be, otherwise he will break the natural order and bring about chaos. But at the same time, as he is the All-Father and the ruler, he is officially not ruled by the fates. So we're in this odd, paradoxical situation. And ironically, it is very much at the heart of the matter of the ring cycle. Wotan is governed by his own position as the ruler of law and order. And the tension between the two is constantly there through the plays. So, for instance, in the Iliad, in Homer's The Iliad, Zeus has one of his many children, semi-divine heroes, Sarpedon. He's over in Troy fighting with the Trojans, and Zeus is really worried about him. He doesn't want him to die, and he's about to die. So Zeus wants to bring Sarpedon home and get him out of the way of trouble, and to save him for another day. And Hera says to him, if you send Sarpedon back to his homeland still alive, why should some other god not also want to deliver his own dear son from the deadly gamble of battle? Many of those who fight for the mighty city of Priam are also sons of gods. Is exciting their rage what you want? In other words, if Zeus does what's in his heart and removes his son, saves his son, then he will break the law, and everybody else can then break the law. So Zeus can act against fate, but to do so would remove the norms, so he never does. He can, but the whole basis of his rule is that he does not. The paradox at the heart. And maybe the paradox at the heart of the power of all autocracy. How things could work in such a governance structure. And if we think about those times and we think about the rule of autocracy or oligarchies, the rule by the few of the many, or by the one by the many, the only way that works is if the autocrat does not break the social norms, because otherwise there is nothing gluing that society together. And of course, that also connects to free will, which I'm going to return to a little later after I take a sip of water. So Wotan is, of course, in a very similar position. The struggle between what must happen, his own limits to impact the situation, the need for a hero who he has not touched in some way, so that there is free will, but he has broken his own rules at the beginning of the cycle. He's been led astray by his greed for the ring, and he is now cursed. And he is scrambling to shore up his authority, and therefore the laws of the universe. And he is trying to do so while, at the same time, he is still pursuing the original sin. He wants that ring. And everything else has to move aside for it. So constantly there is this tension throughout the plays we are seeing this week between his need to uphold the laws of his universe and his desire for the ring. Wotan wants to support Sigmund, for example, but he can't, as Fricka points out, just like Sarpedon, just like Zeus and Hera. Hera says to Zeus, no, you can't. And Fricka says to Wotan, you have to uphold the rules of marriage. Because marriage is another part of that rule of law. Hera and Zeus, and here we come to the third wife of Zeus. I'm running out of, this is the third, right. As I said, there's a lot more afterwards. Hera is the goddess of marriage and the spurned and cuckolded wife of Zeus, rather like Wotan behaves to Fricka. Hera pursues anybody Zeus touches or goes near, and I'm sure you all know the stories, for instance, when she tries to kill off Hercules in his crib, or their offspring, whether they wanted it or not. So basically, Zeus swoops in, rapes some poor innocent woman, and then Hera hounds the woman across wherever. I think there's the story of Io, who becomes a cow, which is the symbol of Hera. And Hera sends gadflies to send Io mad, and she runs and runs and runs all across Europe until she comes and becomes the founder of Thebes. So Hera is a vengeful goddess. It doesn't matter if the girl wanted it or not. And it doesn't matter whether the son was involved in the sin or not. The sins of the fathers definitely are moved on to the children. And in a way, it's understandable. Adultery undermines the bonds of marriage. It is, in many respects, certainly of these worlds, the great threat, because it undermines the idea, as I said earlier, of property and rank, of inheritance. In other words, one of the key pillars of the natural order. So Zeus's fourth partner, this is the last one, I promise, is Mnemosyne. And she is memory, what we remember. And from that union, they beget the muses, who sit either side of us. Memory, because all these stories that we are hearing, all these stories that we are seeing playing out here, are from an oral tradition. And that was a vital component. You're not going to remember unless you have great memory. I've actually been doing some work on memory studies, but that's a different lecture recently. And it's a really fascinating area. But memory, the oral tradition, the very origin of the stories, the beginning of the story you see here is literally in the idea of memory and what we can memorize and the stories we tell from it, which is why memory begets the muses. But also because the stories that memory gives us, that we're allowed to remember, can be true or untrue. So in that respect, it is also the beginning of, shall we say, lies, or the creative truth that we now know as fiction. So one of the earliest stories, actually from Hesiod's Theogony, about the muses is, first the daughters divine of aegis brandishing Zeus, the muses who dwell on Olympus, delivered this instruction. You stupid rustic shepherds, bellies and nothing more. We are the ones who can tell you lies that look like truth. We can also, if we please, proclaim what indeed is true. So here we have them, either side of our arch. They literally frame our story. Is what we are seeing the real thing? Are we being shown an eternal truth? Or are we being shown a web of lies and deceit? What is this story and how do we value it? So all of these people, these figures, put into question and reflect on what is going on here. So the stories that we see in Greek mythology and also in Norse mythology are threefold in type. The first one, and I've just quoted from it, Hesiod's Theogony. Hesiod put this together just in the kind of pre-classical period of Greece, and it's a collection of oral tradition stories, and it's the first time those stories have been brought together. It's about the creation of the world and who begat who, etc., etc. So all those stories that you know of about Greek mythology, they basically come from Hesiod's Theogony. And in that respect, it is essentially akin to the traveling sagas of the Norse, an earlier version. So we can see the two are connected. So the story of Otter's Ring is the sort of story that you get in Hesiod's Theogony. Then you have a different type of writing about the gods, and that is the epics. And I've already mentioned one of them, Homer's Iliad, otherwise known as the Matter of Troy. Now, the Matter of Troy, we've already talked a little bit about the breaking of divine law in some of the myths and stories, but there is another natural, shall we say, pillar of the natural order that comes out of the Matter of Troy, and that is about guest right. And this is something that, again, is extremely important that we see here in the ring cycle. So we have the issue of marriage, we have the issue of treaties and Wotan needing to uphold the rules that he himself created. And then thirdly, we see in the two plays we're watching this week, the breaking of what the Greeks called xenia. This is the code of trust and custom around being a guest. I'm sure people are thinking now, really, the Trojan War? Well, if you think about it, the whole of the Trojan War is based on the fact that Paris, Prince of Troy, turns up at the court of Menelaus, the number 2 in the Argive dynasty in Greece, sees Helen, Menelaus's wife, and decides, I'm running off with her. And so breaks the rules, the custom of the guest, as well as the marriage rules, and hauls her off to Troy. In fact, this is such a kind of like an original sin of Themis, of divine justice, that in some stories, the Greeks actually tried to kind of forgive Helen and sort of mollify it a little bit. So there's this great story, alternative story, that in fact the Helen at Troy was not the real Helen. She was actually a kind of like thing made of matter that Zeus had made and stuck in there. And the real Helen spent the whole 10 years of the war in Egypt, basically living it up and having a good time. And so it's all good for Helen. But this is the basis of the entire matter of Troy. So the code of trust custom around guest rights has been broken, and therefore Troy must fall. There's no argument about that. It has to, because the natural order needs to be restored. And that's also why Zeus can't keep interfering. The problem, so it's just like the Otter's Ring in many respects. Even though Loki didn't know that he was killing off the child of his host, he did. And that is a huge problem. So, so obviously it's more ambiguous, but still, it's the same idea. So the Matter of Troy, the Iliad, is very much like, in terms of being an epic, the Nibelungenlied. But the difference with the Iliad is that it is truly framed by the divine, whereas the Nibelungenlied is very much connected to the world of mortal life. The Iliad has a human comedy, but is then circumvented by a divine comedy, just like the ring cycle. So in many respects, the ring cycle partakes more of an epic like the Iliad rather than the Norse equivalent. And the Iliad, for those of you who've read it, it's full of squabbling around the, what God can do what, who's going to appear where, etc., etc., etc. And in both this epic and also the third type of literature that we can see connected to mythology, gods are spectators. They want to be involved in the human comedy, and they're perpetually trying to meddle, but there are, as I've said, limits. So the final type of sort of mythological or conversations around the immortals that we see in Greek mythology is classical tragedy, of course. And these are extraordinary shared moments of hubris, and they are more akin to the type of experience that we're getting with the ring cycle. If we think of Hesiod, if we think of the Norse traveling sagas, these are memory stories on the page, and the muses remind us of this. In the second type, the epic, you can have the gods frame the whole conversation, but again, it is something on a page. But classical tragedy is drama, and it is what we are experiencing here. So there has to be an element of this piece too in my comparison. And what we see in classical tragedy are these extraordinary shared moments of hubris, that is overstepping, of pity, of fear, and ultimately some type of catharsis, a removal of pity and fear in order to be ritually cleansed of our emotions. To be an Aristotelian for one small minute, and I can tell you absolutely I'm not an Aristotelian, but let's use Aristotle anyway today, because I'm also going to set aside tragedy, because I don't believe that the ring cycle is really that either. There are the actions in classical tragedy of mortals. They precipitate events, but so often situations emerge because there has been an original sin against the gods. And the example I want to give here, because it's a useful one again for understanding of the ring cycle, is the Oresteia. And the Oresteia begins with an original sin that happens even before the Oresteia begins. That's a trilogy of plays, the first one of which, of course, is Agamemnon. You'll probably recognize it as I go along. But the original sin happens before the play starts. And the original sin is something so horrific that I don't think any of us can argue about what that sin is, but it's also very, very reminiscent of something that happens in the ring cycle, and that is the sacrifice of Iphigenia in Aulus. So King Agamemnon, Menelaus has had his wife taken away, and so Menelaus goes to Agamemnon, the king of all the Greeks, of the Argolids, and says, you have to avenge me, we have to raise an army, we have to go to Troy. So they put an army together, they go to find Troy. Here's the weird bit, which probably you're not aware of. They don't know where Troy is, right? So they're looking around, they haven't got a clue. Somebody's going, well, I think it's over there and over there. So they make a couple of missed landings. And they eventually end up back on this island called Aulus. And they're like, okay, what are we going to do? And they find out by some secret intel that where Troy is. But then they can't get a wind there. So the ships are all there, the fleet is there, Achilles is there, everybody's ready to go and beat up Trojans. But they have no wind to get there. And the story goes that the reason they have no wind is because Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, who she might be one of the kids up there, one of the babies up there, the girl child at the front. Agamemnon went out and killed a deer and said, my shot is as good as Artemis's. No. So she says, I'm not going to give you a wind unless, wait for it, you sacrifice your youngest daughter to me. And there's a horrible argument about this, and this is the one that always gets me in Greek tragedy. Still does. And I'm going to read a quote from Aeschylus's Agamemnon, which is thinking about that moment and what Agamemnon did. But once he bowed his neck to necessity's yoke, a sigh gave proof of his terrible change of heart. Unholy, faithless, obscene, even though he's doing it because Artemis says he must. He's already being told what he's doing is unholy, faithful, and obscene. He can't win this. Grim and unyielding he stood, unmoved by scruple. Wicked intention arouses a sort of courage. Stubborn, deranged, begetter of endless sorrow, he nerved himself to be his daughter's butcher, to prosecute a war fought over a woman, to make this payment on his Navy's budget. Her youth, her pleas, her anxious cries of daddy affected not at all the grim old men whose plans demanded war. Her father finished reciting ritual prayers and gave the acolytes their orders to see her properly dressed, even though she collapsed and fainted, to bring her quickly and smoothly and lift her on the altar, just as they would a sacrificial goat, to gag her pretty mouth, to silence her words with calm but wordless force, to keep unseemly cries from polluting her family. She let her wedding dress drop to the ground. She shot a piteous glance at each of her killers, eager to speak like a picture from happier times when she used to sing at feasts in her father's halls. When the cheerful wine cup had passed 3 times, with clear maiden voice she would add to the grace of the luck-bringing hymn of Apollo. I saw no more. I have no more to tell. But Colchis's prophecies always come true. The scales of justice incline to the man who learns from what he goes through. We can know the future only when it is past. Ignore it till then, for worry means premature sorrow. I don't know about all of you, but like what keeps coming to my mind when I think about this, not a human sacrifice, but yet so very sacrificial. The way that Wotan puts Brunhilde to sleep and lays her on an altar, a sacrificial altar, so that any man who comes by may take her like a common whore. Who does that to their daughter? So, from this terrible moment comes the downfall of the House of Atreides, the collapse of Greek civilization, actually, at the time. Clytemnestra and her lover kill Agamemnon because he sacrificed her daughter. Orestes, her son, has to kill Clytemnestra because he has to avenge his father. Because Apollo says he must avenge Agamemnon. But then Orestes has killed his mother, and the Furies are after him. This ends in a trial presided by Athena, who restores justice and changes the nature of the Furies into the kindly ones, placing them within the rule of law and justice. But there isn't going to be that ending in the ring cycle. So we can see the similarities. I'm not going to get into why things are so similar between these 2 great mythic cycles and how the gods interact with mortals and the stories we have chosen to tell about those interactions. But I will say one thing. So much of what is the same comes from, and that is whether Greeks, Norse, or us and our actions and what we see in the world around us, our history, so much of what is the same comes from our own reflection upon ourselves and a mutual understanding and agreement of our existence in this universe as bound by social rules and norms, our ethics, our moral code. We try not to lie and cheat, unlike Wotan. We try not to run off with our host's wife. We try not to commit adultery. We do not think it's a good idea to partner with your sibling. We try not to be cruel, and yet how many times in the ring cycle do we end up sympathizing with people who are doing all of those things? We cannot imagine those who cast off their daughters, let alone leave them to be made the poor of any passing man. We cannot imagine agreeing to give up your daughter as a human sacrifice. Who does that? Apparently we do. Which brings me to us, the audience. We have seen inside the ring, the world of the stage. We have seen the spectators and judges around it. But what about us, the audience in the darkness? Gripped by the power of the ring, Wotan is focused on producing a hero that has free will, untouched by a god, because only that person can go and get the ring for him. He doesn't want free will. He wants somebody who is going to be ruled by his rules to go and get the ring for him, but is also at the same time untouched by his will. He has created a paradox, because ultimately he's attempting to create a situation to bring about the free will decisions that will lead to what he wants. It is like us encapsulated in this space here. Siegfried has the free will, but he is the product of Wotan, and he is tied to the destruction of the cosmos that he is in right from the beginning. So who has the free will here? Are we all tied in this way? Are we truly all trapped forever in this? Do we all have to say yes? These figures play out the eternal story of destruction again and again and again. The ring is infinite. It has no beginning and no end, and the fall is inevitable in the beginning. These gods around us watching, they too are caught, suspended for all time, watching us, watching them, frozen in an interplay with the human world. Only you, the audience, you're free to come, you're free to go. You are free to make a decision at every moment of your lives. Know from this story that you are watching, that you are participating in, that there is no right decision. That is very clear. That leads to a brighter future. Sigmund takes Sigalunda, Linda breaking guest right, but Sigalinda has been forced into marriage. Should she have stayed there? Or should she have gone off and married her brother? Everything is complicated. But how much here could have been changed by some self-reflection, some kindness, some compassion? Just throwing it out there. For ultimately, we are not watching a tragedy either. It's not an epic, it's not an oral tradition, it's not a tragedy either. For let me ask you, whose tragedy would this be? Instead, we are watching something rather different, an epic on the stage, and that's why I use the phrase, a divine comedy, about the gods that is, in the end, a human comedy about us. We participate, and in so doing, we take on the burden of judgment, and therefore, we have the burden of choice. We, unlike those on the stage, are not bound by the ring. We can choose differently. Thank you.
So, off the cuff, how much you honor our place of production and our actual location, and this is just wonderful what you've given us. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. It was so much fun to do.
Great. So it's about, I think we're about 5 minutes to the hour and Ben's lecture. I'd like to. We could use the 5 minutes for questions specifically to Sophie, or we could take a stretch break or something else. Would anybody like to? Wally.
You've given us a brilliant lecture and made me see things I've never seen before. Even though I'm married to a classicist. And it occurred to me, though, to what extent do you think Wagner saw these parallelisms and was influenced?
I must admit, I haven't tended to focus on Wagner per se, because I was actually originally, before I was a philosopher, I was actually a literature professor. So I come from that tradition. And so I tend to focus on the text. And also Wagner always makes everything way more complicated, right, when you get into that. So I have used it as a text. How much did Wagner know? I think we should assume it's in the zeitgeist, that all of these ideas are definitely there. And I think the commonalities between these mythical cycles are commonalities for a reason, but I don't want to get too universalist about it. But I'm sure Wagner knew the stories, yes. Yeah, for sure. But as I said, and I think I quoted it early on, I kept wanting to, all I could think of when I was thinking about this lecture was, the title of Nietzsche's book, Human All Too Human. And the fact that, they were connected and friends, and of course, as you know, they had a very lively debate around the Dionysian and the Apollonian and the relationship between music and Greek mythology. And so I think that has to be seen as part of the picture. Yeah. Hi. No.
What was the book that you quoted from?
The Iphigenia. So that is actually from a play. That is from Agamemnon, which is the first play of the Oresteia by Aeschylus.
Because I know there's different versions with
different translations.
Different translations, and then some people will kind of break it down into like a discourse. So I'm interested in that.
This is a relatively contemporary translation. And I will give you, hang on a second, let me see. So this one was actually done by a classicist called Barry B. Powell, who I find pretty good for this type of thing. And he's trying to do something a bit less, he's not trying to be poetic, he's trying to be more truer to the spirit of the thing, shall we say. So it's taken from a book that is very useful. It's called Classical Myths, and it goes through, and it provides lovely quotations from things. But yeah, you're right. The actual, like if you go and get the Penguin Classic or whatever, there's lots and lots of different translations. But I chose this one because I liked it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe a stretch, or Ben, do you want to start?
Stretch break.
Yeah.